Alright, today is going to be an overview. This is a tutorial already made by someone. So this isn't a tutorial, but it's an overview. There were some questions that I saw posted in the comments of how to do the UVs, and I'm going to answer some of the texture setups. And then there's an additional setup we can do here where we can kind of make a little ribbon system like this. And you can drag it out, and you just add however many points you want, and it spawns in the points, and then you can even make it like a full loop like that. So we're going to go over that system at the end, and I'll overview all the different settings. The other tutorial goes in very nice detail on how to actually set up this material and how to do the texture. But we'll go over the tips on that. So the first thing, and there's also some improvements to make sure the UVs don't stretch when you like pull it out. So the first thing we're going to do is the actual model, which is extremely simple actually. So I just made a plane there. So that's Shift A, make the plane. I'm going to click Tab, go into edit mode. I'm going to rotate around the x-axis. I'm clicking up. So RX90. And then we're going to jump to the UV editor. And then we're going to scale it down on Z-axis by 0.05. And the reason we want to scale it by that is because the texture has 20 sections. So it's if you divide 1 by 20, you get 0.05. So that's the ratio we want. We want it 20 by 1 basically. But now the UVs are going to be messed up. So all we need to do here is to put 0.95 on this line, and that's your UV setup. The other thing you might want to do if you want to make this like with this setup where you can stretch it and do this, I also push it to one side. So G, X, and I think 1 like that on the X-axis right there. And then you can just export this as an FBX, name it whatever you want, and then drag it into Unreal. I already have mine dragged into Unreal right here. And that is how you get this. Like that. And then a few tips on GIMP side of things. They obviously have way more things in their slots. I didn't think of 20 things to put in mine. I was just testing it out. A few tips though about things to make it a bit easier on yourself in GIMP. GIMP does have a grid system. So you can do show grid. And then if you go under view or image, I think, you can configure your grid. So I've configured my grid. I've changed the color so you can actually see it on a black background. And then I've spaced it. This image is 2000 by 2000. And so the horizontal lines, I've just made that because I don't want any horizontal or vertical lines. And then the vertical I've made by 100, like that. And then I do make sure to leave a little bit of space just so you don't get bleed through in Unreal. I'm sure there's some like texture compression settings that you could set on this to make it not compress at all. I think maybe 2D interfaces don't compress at all. I'm sure you could set it that way. I didn't bother. I just left a very small gap, and that seems to fix it. You could also fix that in this and maybe make the UV slightly smaller than it needs to be, and that would also fix bleed through. but something to consider. The other thing that I figured out in Blender is just actually render pattern. Let's make a new layer actually. Here we go. Filter, render pattern. There's a grid generator here. Let's see. Oh, let's pull this to the top so we can actually see it. Render pattern grid. So you can see it's black right now. So if we make it white. So you can use that to turn off the, so if you just want like vertical lines like this, and then you control the width and the offset. And this is really good for, let's see, the height shouldn't do anything. Yeah, and then this, you can use this to kind of generate your nice even lines. How many lines we want here? Yeah, and then you can make them nice and thick. Let's say we want only a few and we want them super thick, like that. And then we can use systems, the rotate system. And then I think the ones I use are rotated by about 30 degrees, like that. And then you can see how by kind of combining these, you can get the little arrows and things like that. So that seemed to work pretty well. The other thing that's helpful, of course, is making groups in Blender. So that way things are sorted well. So I've covered the UVs, the pivot point, and then the last thing we'll go over is what to actually do in Unreal to improve on the system. Let me overview the material itself. The only difference I did here was the X offset. So you can actually factor in the object scale. So what that's doing, this is a good example, is so in order for the UVs not to get stretched when you scale this object, I'm just multiplying the R UV coordinate by the object scale. So as you scale the object up, the UV gets adjusted appropriately. So just for example, I'll apply this without that. And you see we get these super stretched dots. But if you factor this in, it means it stays even and unstretched. In terms of the actual blueprint, this is all in the construction script of this little fence system we have here. You have the different posts and you can add post. It's not quite like a spline, so you can't like add one in the center, but it's fairly flexible. You can change whatever material you want here. And then you can also decide if you want it to be a full loop or if you want it to be just like a straight fence. Like let's say you wanted this just to go like that. These posts are just cylinders. I actually took my cylinder and exported it with export selected. So I just pulled in a cylinder, scaled it how I wanted, and exported it, and then brought it back into Unreal. Export selected, and then turn it into what I wanted. This system, I have one at 0, and then the rest you add per instance. So I have it set to instance. I have show 3D widget. The ribbon mat, I have instance editable, and just have one of the instances by default, and then the loop, I have this turned off by default, also instance editable. So I go through the each loop, and then I'm adding the static mesh. So this is the adding the fence post. Just the post, the material, I think everything is basically a default here. Block all dynamic, show shadows. And then what I'm doing is I'm checking the index. And if it's not the, let's see, how would I explain this? So if it's the last index, then it's finding the look at rotation and the distance. And I'm adding in my little ribbon, and however wide this is, so by default this is 200, so you can see 200 by 0 by 10. So that's the bounds, and you factor that into the scale, so that way the ribbon scales, so it's looking at the next fence post. And if it's the last fence post, you just have it look at the first fence post, which is what this does right there. But only do that if you actually want a full loop. And that's what that checks. And then you're just setting, so it's looking in the right direction, and then you just set the scale. And the difference on this one, I turned off the collision, and then I also turned off the shadows. Where are the shadows? There you go, cast shadow, turn off, since I don't think it makes sense for a hologram to cast a shadow. And I'm just setting the material with the ribbon right there. And then the last thing, oh, and it does work vertically a little bit. I'm sure there's some limit to where, oh, that's the one we just placed there. We can delete that. So yeah. It doesn't, this is all calculated in relative transforms. That seemed easier, relative transforms, but it doesn't necessarily have to be that way. So let me just give you an overview in case you wanted to copy this. And other than that, if y'all have any questions, feel free to ask. I thought the other tutorial was really cool, so I wanted to make this just kind of expanding on that system and kind of showing a use case, and have fun.